Moving on to the selection and hiring process, we need to be aware of how we gather information and we assess people during that process. We want to make sure that the information that we're gathering is not inappropriate and discriminatory, and we want to make sure we use criteria that is not discriminatory. So, for example, in your application phase, the applicant is filling out that application form, and it may be asking for information, for example, a maiden name or things like that. So there may be unconscious bias even if we're reviewing people's names, right? We might see the name Jordan and necessarily assume it's a man, but it might be a woman. Or vice versa, we might see a name Marion and assume it's a woman when it's actually a man. And so we don't want to be making assumptions about people's names, particularly if they have ethnic names, to assume that that necessarily means anything other than they may be the best candidate for the job. So we have to avoid those triggers that are going to make us assume that somebody may be less qualified based on their own unconscious bias or discriminatory behaviors. Every state obviously has its own variations on some of these rules of guidance, but we want to be aware that we don't want to be discriminating against people based on criteria that we see in the application blank, and that we need to be very careful about that to be sure that we are not using that criteria to make a poor decision. Now, employers can ask people about whether or not they've been tested for COVID or whether or not they've had vaccines. So there are some pandemic related issues and information that we can gather that the law allows us to gather, but it may still have a negative impact on people regarding medical conditions and things like that. So we want to also be really careful when we're monitoring people that we're not using information that may be screening people out of the process. Just because someone's had COVID doesn't mean that they couldn't come and do a job, right? And so we want to be careful about how we ask that information in advance of the job versus after we've made our job offer and say, are there any accommodations you need made or things of that nature. So we want to be sure that we're not asking stuff that's going to trigger a reaction to discriminating based on race or sex or family status or medical status for that matter. In the interview, we also want to make sure that we are training the people who are conducting interviews. They need to be careful how to ask questions. They need to be careful about how they score those questions. They need to be able to recognize that as they're interviewing people, that there may be unconscious bias associated with somebody's how they present themselves. If they're transgender, there may be issues with how they present themselves. There may be issues with male versus female, race, sex, you name it. So what we're trying to do in training people to be ready for interviews is ensuring that they are not going to be allowing those unconscious biases and stereotypes to drive the decisions that they make during the evaluation process, including during the interview process. So we want to make sure that we are asking appropriate questions that are not inappropriate and could be determined to be discriminatory, but we also want to make sure as we're assessing how people answer questions, we're not overlaying a bias to that and saying, oh, well, they only said that because they're a woman or they're a man or they're black or they're Muslim or whatever. We stay away from the stereotype assumptions about how someone should or shouldn't answer a question and really just evaluate them based on the quality of the answer that they give. So that's the quality of the assessment of the quality has to be based on objective criteria and not based on subjective criteria. So we conduct background and reference checks because we have to do our due diligence to ensure that the person who is applying for the job actually has the credentials that they say they have or the work experience that they say that they have on their resume. And so people lie on their resumes all the time. People lie in the application blanks all the time. And it is inappropriate to misrepresent your credentials. For example, you went to University of Wisconsin-Madison, but instead you said you went to Northwestern University. So maybe you went to one school, but you don't like that school, and so you want to say that you went somewhere else, and you think that, oh, there's no harm in that. Well, you're misrepresenting that you were a part of Northwestern University, and therefore you should not be, you're lying about those credentials, and that would get you in a situation where you would lose your job. Now, I know somebody who lied about the year that they graduated, and they said, no, I graduated this year, when actually it was a couple of years later. And because they misrepresented themselves on a job to go work for Goldman Sachs, they lost that job opportunity because they lied about their experience. So, and they lied about when they actually graduated. So it is important that you are very clear and upfront, with no lies, no misrepresentation of your credentials. Your credentials are what they are, period. Don't pretend you went to a school that you didn't go to. Don't pretend that you had experience that you didn't have. Don't change the dates on your graduation dates and work-related dates. You simply need to be truthful and straightforward. And so if an employer finds that information out, they could revoke a job offer, or they could not make you an offer in the first place because of that. Background checks, we have to get permission to do a background check. Typically, that has to be done in writing. And what we're doing is we're verifying some of the things that the candidate said in the job interview. We want to make sure that there's no history in any background history that would maybe make them ineligible to work for our company. For example, if they are going to be working with children, but they have in their past history that they were accused of abusing a child, or engaging in some sort of assault, and we wouldn't want to have somebody working for us that went to jail for those things or has that in their record. Now, it's a very different thing to say they have a record of those things, or there were allegations of those things. I mean, allegations, if they were not arrested and convicted, then the allegations are not necessarily valid. So that's why we ask for not arrest record, but conviction record when we're talking about background checks. So if someone was convicted of a crime, that's a different thing than someone who was accused of a crime but may have not committed it in the first place. References, and what we're doing is we're asking references to so that we have somebody who perhaps worked with that individual, whether it's somebody who is a teacher or a coworker that you worked with who can say, yes, this person did this work and they worked here for this period of time. Most reference checks, people are afraid to give much more information other than to say they worked for us during this period of time, they make this amount of money, and that's about it. The next thing to be aware of is negligent hiring. And again, I'm going to go back to the example of, I'm doing that background check and finding out that somebody, has a conviction for child abuse or physical assault. And let's say that I'm running a daycare center and I don't do a background check and I don't find out that the person I just hired has a past history of abusing children, that they've been convicted of this, that I would be accused of negligent hiring because I didn't do my due diligence to do the checks to make sure that the individual is truthful about the information that they were communicating and that there were no risks in their background that I missed because I decided to be lazy and take a shortcut. So that's very important. There are some interesting things I want to talk about, though, regarding this idea of convictions versus arrests and stuff like that. There's some laws out there called ban the box. And basically what that means is, and you'll see this on page 171 in your textbook, the ban the box basically is a situation where we don't want to remove the ability from someone who was incarcerated from getting a job if the thing that incarcerated them was not necessarily related to the job that they're applying for. And the example, we go back to the child abuse example. Let's say that the job doesn't require working with children. And if someone abused a child in their past, but this job doesn't have them working with children, then that's not a risk for this particular job. Now, if someone was had issues with theft, then I might be able to say, well, they're a thief and they're working with money, so I can't have them doing that work here for my company because, obviously that creates a risk. But what they're hoping to do is, by having this thing called ban the box, is that we're removing the stigma of someone's conviction history, and removing that question in the in the application blanks, because oftentimes if you have it on an application blank, that removes them from any consideration for a job immediately. So you need to know which state and local areas have a ban the box law in place. I don't believe that in Illinois does, but there may be in other states where that's a situation. Our goal, of course, is to recognize that the biggest contribution to crime recidivism, right? People returning to the crimes that put them in jail in the first place, is not having a job and a means of income in order for them to get out of the cycle that they were in the first place. And so what we want to be able to do is in doing the background checks and things like that, we're going to catch that information, and we're going to know, even if we don't have it on the application blank, if we do the background check like we're supposed to, we'll be able to see whether or not there was anything in their history that has a direct impact on our jobs and the way that we do our work. So we can check and screen if somebody has any issues with, child abuse or theft or things like that would have a negative impact on their ability to do the job. Drug abuse, right? If someone went to jail because they were trying to sell drugs, well, it's because they didn't have a job and they maybe were trying to make money. So we wouldn't necessarily, omit them from the pool of applicants simply because they went to jail because they, used marijuana or were trying to sell marijuana, et cetera, et cetera. This is just a great graphic from the textbook. It's Exhibit 4.5, talking about the grounds for negligent hiring claim. In order to prove that, the plaintiff has to show that there was an existence, first of all, of an employer-employee relationship. Number two, that the employee's incompetence or inappropriateness is in the position exists, so that it's there, that the employer actually had knowledge of this or constructive knowledge of this, or that the employee's act or omission caused the plaintiff's injury, and that the employer's negligence in hiring or retaining the employee was the proximate cause of the plaintiff's injury. So basically what it means is, if you didn't do a background check, or you did the background check and you ignored the information anyway, there's still an issue of negligent hiring, that a plaintiff can complain that, I was hurt on the job, or I was abused on the job from somebody who shouldn't have been there in the first place, or that person stole from me, and that should have been cleared, and the person's background check should have noticed that, and we should have had them removed. So if you're making a horrible hiring decision and you're willing to hire people who are inappropriate, that's going to create a problem for you as the employer. With respect to employer liability and protection, there's a couple of factors that we need to be aware of. Number one, with reference checks, previous employers, could be held liable for negligent misrepresentation if they are based on any misleading statements they may make in an employment reference. So, for example, if you say, yes, I fired them because they stole from me, that's a very different situation than saying, they no longer work for us. They only work for us during this period of time and they're not eligible for rehire. You're not making a statement actually about why they did, because once you are making a statement and misrepresenting what they did, then you're compelling the applicant to then talk about what that is. Now, let's say that you're making a charge that that person stole from you, and it's simply an allegation, but in fact they didn't steal from you, and you don't know. We don't have that information. They say they may have thought that the person did it, and they may make a very quick decision to say, nope, you're gone, you're out of here. You stole from me, and that's that. So that person now, in trying to find a new job, has to say, yes, I was fired for this reason, but it's not true. But that they are then compelled to talk about a previous situation that may be defamatory, that maybe didn't really happen, maybe was not an issue. In fact, they can say, no, I was fired for this, but it wasn't truthful. For example, my daughter was fired because she got hurt on the job and she needed to leave to go to the emergency room, even though her employer was telling her she couldn't leave, and if she left, she would get fired. But she was hurt on the job and she needed to go to the emergency room. She was in a lot of pain. So it was a very challenging situation in terms of deciding what to do. And she ended up having to leave. There was somebody covering the register, but she had to leave to go and take care of herself. So it was a major problem, for her. And now she's got problems, in terms of talking to other employers about, why she was let go, because it's misleading as if she was fired for being a poor worker, when in fact it was the employer that was having problems in the way that they handled things, and a policy that made no sense because they had bare bones coverage for their shifts, which was inappropriate. So bottom line is, be careful what you say, because if you are compelling somebody to talk about something, it better be factual. It better be as we talked about before, right? We want to make sure that it is truthful and factual information, and that it is not an opinion on anything. You can say, it's in my opinion that they were a poor worker, but we want to work off of material facts. I have evidence that they stole from me, and yes, you can state if you've got evidence that they stole from you. That's different than saying, I think they stole from me, right? We want to be careful about that difference. After acquired evidence is where information is acquired after a person is hired. We found out, that this person really misrepresented themselves. That misrepresentation doesn't mean that you get to keep your job. So even though you passed the original screening, if the employer finds out after the fact that you misled people about certain facts, and that comes up, then you could be let go for that, and you're not protected from being fired in those circumstances. And that's kind of what happened with that Goldman Sachs example I gave from a previous slide. The person got hired and the person started the job, but once they dug into information and they verified that the information on the resume was misrepresented, and it became what they call after acquired evidence. After the person was hired, the evidence came in, that the person actually hadn't graduated when they said that they graduated, and they felt that was enough for them to be fired for misrepresenting themselves in the job process. So it's challenging when that happens.